At 7:43 in the morning on the 26th of July, 1944, a column of German armor was moving south along a farm road 3 miles east of the village of Saint-Gilles in Normandy. The column consisted of 11 vehicles, 4 Mark IV Panzer tanks, 2 Panzer IVs with a long-barreled 75mm gun, 3 half-tracks carrying infantry from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and 2 fuel trucks moving under the shelter of the armored vehicles because the fuel trucks could not be left behind. The column commander was an SS-Untersturmführer, a second lieutenant, named in no American after-action report that has survived. His age is not recorded. What is recorded is that he was moving in daylight, which his orders required and which his instincts had learned, over the previous 6 weeks, to dread. The sky that morning was clear. A scattered overcast had burned off before dawn. Visibility over the bocage country, the sunken farm lanes, the dense hedgerows, the small stone fields of western Normandy, was unrestricted above 2,000 feet. The column had covered 11 miles since first light. It had 4 more miles to reach the assembly area where the 2nd SS was attempting to consolidate its armor for a counterattack against the American breakout corridor that General Omar Bradley's First Army had been pushing south and west since the opening of Operation Cobra 3 days earlier. The column commander did not hear the P-47 Thunderbolts until they were already in their dives. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. There were 8 of them from the 365th Fighter Group based at Airfield 7 near Dujamos, approximately 40 miles north. Their mission that morning was armed reconnaissance, a term the 9th Air Force used to describe what was, in operational practice, a systematic hunt for anything moving on the roads and rail lines behind the German front. The flight leader, a captain whose name appears in the 365th's operational records as leading the mission, but whose individual aircraft cannot be confirmed against the action, had spotted the column from 6,500 feet. He had seen the dust trail first, the fine chalk gray line that German vehicles raised on the dry Normandy farm roads in late July. And then, dropping lower to confirm, he had seen the angular silhouettes of the Mark IVs and the half-tracks and the fuel trucks catching the morning light. He made one radio call. He gave the attack order. What happened to the 11 vehicles in the next 4 minutes is not a story about bravery or cowardice. The men in those vehicles were not given a choice that involved surviving. This is a story about a problem the German army had been accumulating since the summer of 1942, a problem that no amount of tactical skill, unit cohesion, or material quality could answer, because the problem was not a weapon. The problem was a system. And by the summer of 1944 in Normandy, that system had achieved a density and a lethality that made the movement of German armor in daylight less a military option than a calculation of acceptable losses. The men in the column that morning were inside that calculation, and they did not know the numbers. To understand what those numbers meant, and why German tank commanders had come to understand them in their bones even when they could not name them precisely, the story has to begin 2 years earlier and 3,000 miles to the west, in a set of problems the United States Army Air Forces had been wrestling with since the first weeks of the war. The doctrine the Yuzov carried into the Second World War was built around strategic bombing. The belief that American heavy bombers, flying in formation at high altitude in daylight, could destroy the industrial and logistical infrastructure of an enemy state with sufficient precision to make ground invasion either unnecessary or nearly so. That doctrine had been refined through the 1930s at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama, where its architects, officers like Harold George, Donald Wilson, and Kenneth Walker, had argued that a modern industrial state was a system of interconnected vulnerabilities, and that a bomber force capable of reaching and destroying those vulnerabilities, oil refineries, ball bearing plants, rail junctions, power stations, could collapse an enemy's capacity to wage war without the grinding attrition of land combat. The bomber, in this framework, was the decisive weapon. The fighter was a defensive concession. What this doctrine did not adequately address was the use of tactical air power, fighters and fighter bombers operating in direct support of ground forces, attacking the enemy's army in the field rather than his factories at home. The men who wrote the manuals were strategic thinkers. The ground war, in their framework, was the consequence of strategic success, not its instrument. The consequences of this doctrinal gap became visible almost immediately. In North Africa in 1942 and 1943, the relationship between American ground forces and the air assets nominally assigned to support them was described by the officers on the ground in language that ranged from frustrated to contemptuous. The Air Force, in the view of infantry and armor commanders who had watched their columns attacked with impunity by the Luftwaffe while American aircraft were committed to other missions, was not supporting the battle. It was fighting a different war at a different altitude over different terrain. General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces, wrote to General George Marshall in the spring of 1943 that the close air support problem was, in his assessment, the most serious operational deficiency the Army had identified in the North African campaign. His language was careful and his language was damning. The bombers were bombing. The fighters were not fighting where the ground commanders needed them. What changed this was not a single document or a single officer. It was an accumulation of pressure from after-action reports, from command inspections, from the testimony of officers who had watched German armor operate with relative freedom from air attack, while American infantry bled in the mountains of Tunisia, that gradually forced a doctrinal revision the strategic bombing advocates resisted. The instrument of that revision was a British officer, Air Marshal Arthur Coningham, commanding the Western Desert Air Force, who had spent 2 years developing what he called the air-ground battle as an integrated system rather than two parallel operations conducted in proximity. Coningham's approach, refined in the Western Desert and formalized in a joint directive issued in February 1943, established that air and ground operations were not merely complementary but functionally inseparable, and that the air commander supporting a ground operation had to be co-located with the ground commander, sharing the same intelligence picture, the same communication network, and the same understanding of the battle's immediate priorities. The American officer who absorbed this lesson most completely and translated it into operational practice was not a pilot. He was a cavalryman. Brigadier General Elwood Quesada, commanding the 9th Tactical Air Command in England in the spring of 1944, was 40 years old, compact, aggressive, and constitutionally incapable of accepting organizational boundaries that he believed were producing inferior results. Quesada had watched the North African campaign from a distance and the Italian campaign from closer range, and what he had concluded was that the existing model of air-ground coordination, in which requests for air support traveled up through ground force channels, across to air force channels, and back down again through a process that typically took between 4 and 6 hours, was producing an air weapon that arrived at the right map coordinate at the wrong moment. The battle had moved. The target was gone. The aircraft had expended their ordnance on abandoned positions or empty roads, and the German armor that the ground commander had needed killed an hour earlier was now in a new position, dug in and waiting. Quesada's answer was structural. He proposed embedding Air Force officers with armored column commanders at the tank level. Not at Corps headquarters, not a division, but inside the lead tank of an armored column, in a vehicle equipped with the radio frequencies to talk directly to aircraft overhead. He called the system Armored Column Cover, and he pushed it through the institutional resistance of officers on both sides of the air-ground divide who believed it violated the principles of centralized air control that Coningham had established. Quesada's argument was that centralized control was right for the allocation of air assets across a theater, but that at the moment of execution, at the level of an armored column moving through a narrow corridor of bocage country with its flanks exposed and its route of advance dependent on what was behind the next hedgerow, the asset had to be controllable by the man who could see the target. He was not wrong. He was also not yet relevant, because in the spring of 1944, Operation Overlord had not yet begun. When it did begin, on the 6th of June, 1944, the Allied air forces deployed over Normandy represented the largest concentration of tactical air power ever assembled in direct support of a ground operation. The 9th Air Force alone, the American component of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, had deployed more than 3,000 aircraft across 46 groups. It had P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs flying escort for the strategic bombing effort, but also had P-47s configured for ground attack, carrying 500-pound bombs and mounting 850 caliber machine guns in their wings that were assigned specifically to the interdiction mission, cutting the roads and rail lines through which German reinforcements would have to move to reach the beachhead. The aircraft doing most of this work was the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. It weighed more than 14,000 pounds at combat load, roughly 4 times the weight of a Japanese Zero fighter, and it was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine rated at 2,300 horsepower at military power, with water injection available for short periods of emergency output. Its top speed at 25,000 feet was 428 miles per hour. At low altitude, where the ground attack mission lived, it was slower, heavier, and less maneuverable than it was at altitude, but at low altitude those characteristics were less relevant than the ones that made it the weapon it had become. The P-47 could absorb damage that would have destroyed a lighter aircraft. It could carry ordnance loads that no previous single-engine fighter had approached, and it could deliver those ordnance loads with an accuracy that high-altitude bombing, regardless of the quality of its bomb sight, could not approach, because the pilot flying AP-47 at 500 feet over a German column was not calculating a release point from 10,000 feet of altitude and adjusting for windage and ground speed. He was looking at the target through his gun sight. The Luftwaffe that had operated over Normandy in June 1944 was not the Luftwaffe that had covered the Wehrmacht's advance through France in May and June of 1940. By the summer of 1944, the German Air Force in the West had been reduced by 4 years of attrition. In Russia, in North Africa, in the daylight skies over Germany, to a force that could contest local air superiority in specific circumstances, but could not provide the continuous fighter cover that German ground forces required. The Jagdwaffe, the fighter arm, was still capable of producing competent individual pilots, but the institutional structure that had supported the mass of experienced aircrew that had made the Luftwaffe the most effective tactical air force in the world in 1940 had been consumed. The replacement pilots arriving at frontline units in the summer of 1944 had received, in many documented cases, fewer than 100 hours of flying time before assignment, compared with the 200 to 300 hours that had been standard in 1940. They were not incompetent. They were not trained. Into this environment, beginning on the 6th of June and accelerating through the 7 weeks of the Normandy campaign, the Allied Tactical Air Forces imposed a condition on German ground operations that the Wehrmacht had not faced since the opening weeks of its own existence as a modern army. German units could not move in daylight without accepting air attack as a near certainty. They could not concentrate armor in the open without inviting destruction. They could not use road networks in the forward areas during daylight hours with any expectation of freedom. Supply columns, ammunition trucks, artillery batteries, recovery vehicles, headquarters elements moving by road, all of these were subject to attack by aircraft that were continuously overhead and continuously hunting. The German response was adaptation, the same institutional reflex that had allowed the Wehrmacht to absorb tactical shocks at every level for 5 years and continue fighting. Units moved at night when the tactical situation permitted. They dispersed their vehicles into the bocage, the dense, tangled hedgerow country of Normandy that the French called the bocage and that provided, when used skillfully, excellent concealment from aerial observation. They placed anti-aircraft weapons, the 20mm Flak Vierling quad mount and the 37mm Flak 36, at the front of their columns and at key road junctions to force attacking aircraft to higher altitudes where accuracy was degraded. They developed protocols for column movement that specified intervals between vehicles, the use of cover during halts, and the immediate dispersal of vehicles upon hearing aircraft engines. These adaptations were genuine, they were effective at the margins, and they were insufficient. The margin they gained was a reduction in the intensity of each individual attack. They did not change the fundamental condition, which was that a German armored or motorized column moving by road in Normandy in the summer of 1944 was operating inside a tactical environment where Allied air power was the dominant factor, where every movement decision had to account for air threat as a primary constraint, and where the cumulative effect of continuous interdiction was degrading the Wehrmacht's capacity to mass forces sustain supply, and execute the kind of large-scale operational maneuver that German doctrine, from the Panzer divisions of 1940 to the SS heavy battalions of 1944, had been built around. The men experiencing this condition most directly were the crews of the armored vehicles themselves. The panzer crews of the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht who fought in Normandy from June to August of 1944 left accounts, in letters, in post-war interrogations, in memoirs written decades later, that describe the psychological weight of operating under continuous air threat with a consistency that crosses unit boundaries and individual perspectives. The precise language varies. The content is uniform. Movement in daylight had become associated at the visceral level with the sound of aircraft engines and the specific topography of exposure, an open road, a cleared field, a village square without overhead cover, in ways that produced responses and experienced combat soldiers that went beyond tactical calculation into something closer to conditioned reflex. An SS-Hauptsturmführer, a captain named Hans Stadegger, who had commanded a Tiger tank platoon in Russia before the Normandy deployment, described in a post-war account the difference between operating under air threat in the East, where Soviet tactical aviation was capable but intermittent, and operating in Normandy, where the American and British fighter bombers were, in his phrase, simply always there. He used the German word allgegenwärtig, omnipresent. His account is specific about the behavioral changes this produced in his crews. The habit of scanning the sky before ordering movement, the instinct to find cover at the sound of any aircraft engine regardless of aircraft type, the degradation of command response time as crews waited for intervals between patrol cycles that did not reliably exist. Stadegger was not a man given to complaint. His record in Russia indicated a willingness to close with the enemy under conditions that had produced Iron Cross decorations at 2 levels. What he described in Normandy was not fear of a specific weapon or a specific attack. It was the institutional weight of an air environment that had removed the tactical freedom his training assumed would be available to him. The weapon doing the most of this work was the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the most effective instrument through which P-47s were directed against German armor was the system that Quesada had fought to establish. The Tactical Air Control Network that put Air Force Forward Air Controllers, initially called Air Liaison Officers, later designated as Forward Air Controllers, with the forward ground elements, equipped to talk directly to aircraft overhead and direct them onto targets they were observing. In real time, the technology that made this possible was not exotic. It was a radio, an SCR 522 VHF set mounted in a modified tank or armored vehicle, operated by an Air Force officer who had both the aviation knowledge to communicate targeting information in terms a pilot could act on and the tactical awareness to understand what the ground commander needed. The simplicity of the hardware was matched by the directness of the communication chain. In the model Quesada had established, the forward air controller on the ground could talk to the flight leader overhead without the transmission passing through any intermediate headquarters. The flight leader could respond, confirm the target, request additional information, and execute. The process from initial target identification to ordnance delivery, in conditions where the aircraft were already airborne and in the patrol area, could be compressed to under 3 minutes. 3 minutes was the interval that determined, in the bocage country of Normandy, whether a German column that had been spotted by a ground controller had time to disperse into the hedgerows before the P-47s rolled in. In most cases, it did not. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. The weapons the P-47s carried against armor were not purpose-designed anti-tank weapons in the sense that later generations of ground attack aircraft would develop. The primary ordnance loads in the Normandy campaign were 500-pound general-purpose bombs, delivered in pairs from a dive angle of between 30 and 45 degrees, and 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, VARs, that had been fitted to P-47 underwing pylons beginning in the spring of 1944. The rockets were less accurate than bombs in the hands of an average pilot, but they were faster in delivery, required no dive-in pull-out sequence that temporarily exposed the aircraft to ground fire, and carried a warhead, a shaped charge variant designated the M64, that could penetrate the side armor of a Mark IV tank at direct hit ranges. Against vehicles with lighter protection, half-tracks, trucks, self-propelled artillery, armored cars. Both weapons were uniformly destructive. The 850 caliber machine guns in the P-47's wings, firing at the combined rate of approximately 6,400 rounds per minute, could not penetrate the frontal or turret armor of a Panzer IV or a Panther. They could penetrate the engine deck armor on most German armored vehicles from above. They could destroy any vehicle with less than 25 millimeters of protection, and they were consistently lethal against the exposed crew positions, external stowage, fuel and ammunition storage, and running gear of every vehicle in a German column. A pilot who had expended his bombs and rockets and was still in the target area with ammunition remaining was not flying a weapon system that had become ineffective. He was flying a system with a different effect, one that suppressed movement, killed crews who exposed themselves, and damaged vehicles in ways that immobilized them without destroying them and left them blocking the road for everything behind them. The tactical effectiveness of this approach depended on numbers and continuity. A single flight of P-47s over a specific road segment for a specific 30-minute window was a threat. A system in which aircraft rotated through patrol areas in sufficient density that any given road segment in the German rear area might be under observation for 6, 8, 10 hours out of a 12-hour daylight period was a different thing entirely. The 9th Air Force's scheduling system in the summer of 1944 was designed specifically to achieve this second condition over the most operationally significant areas, the road and rail network through which German armored reserves would have to move to reach the Normandy front. The 7th Army's logistical chief, General Major Erich Marx, not the same officer as General Erich Marx who commanded 84 Corps and was killed on the 6th of June, but a different officer with the same name, wrote in his supply reports from late June and early July of 1944 that the disruption of road movement by Allied air attack had reduced the predictable delivery rate for fuel, ammunition, and rations to frontline units from a pre-invasion baseline of approximately 80% of scheduled resupply to a realized rate he estimated at between 30 and 40%. His language in these reports is the language of a logistician confronting a supply chain problem that has no logistical solution. He could adjust schedules, route vehicles differently, use smaller convoys and more frequent runs, move at night. All of these measures had been implemented. None of them had restored the supply rate to a level that allowed the frontline divisions to operate at their planned consumption rates, particularly for fuel and ammunition. The consequence for armored operations was specific and mechanical. A Panther tank, the Panzer V that the Germans had deployed in Normandy in significant numbers as the standard medium tank of the armored divisions, consumed approximately 110 gallons of fuel per 100 kilometers of road movement and between 200 and 250 gallons per 100 kilometers of cross-country movement. At the combat distances being covered in Normandy, frequently less than 20 kilometers per day in the bocage, this consumption rate was manageable if resupply was reliable. If resupply was not reliable, if a tank battalion arrived at an assembly area with 60% of its fuel load because the supply column had been attacked and dispersed the previous night, the operational options available to the battalion commander were constrained in ways that had nothing to do with the quality of his crews or the mechanical soundness of his vehicles. This was the system the P-47s were participating in. Each individual attack on a supply column was not, by itself, decisive. The cumulative effect of hundreds of such attacks, conducted continuously over weeks, was the progressive degradation of the Wehrmacht's capacity to sustain armored operations at the intensity its doctrine required. The German officer most directly responsible for confronting this problem was General Feldmarschall Gunther von Kluge, who had taken command of both Army Group B and OB West, the German Supreme Command in the West, on the 17th of July, 1944, following the wounding of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel the previous day. Von Kluge was 61 years old, a Prussian professional soldier with extensive experience on the Eastern Front and a reputation for operational competence that had survived the punishment the Wehrmacht had absorbed in Russia. He had not previously commanded in the West against Anglo-American forces, and his first weeks in command coincided with the opening of the Allied breakout attempt that would become Operation Cobra. Von Kluge's communications with OKW, the German Armed Forces High Command, in the days following the Cobra breakout are a document of a commander attempting to explain to superiors who were not in the theater and who were receiving their picture of the situation through channels that consistently minimized bad news, that the tactical conditions in Normandy were not the conditions that German doctrine had been designed for. His language on the subject of Allied air power is precise and repeated. He used the phrase Luftherrschaft der Gegner, air supremacy of the enemy, in multiple dispatches. He was not using it as a rhetorical complaint. He was using it as an operational variable that he was asking OKW to account for in its assessment of what the forces in Normandy could and could not accomplish. What OKW required him to accomplish was the sealing of the Cobra breakthrough by a counterattack using the armored forces available to Army Group B. On the 2nd of August, Adolf Hitler personally ordered the execution of Operation Luttich, a counterattack by up to 8 panzer divisions against the American penetration corridor at Mortain, aimed at driving through to the sea at Avranches and cutting off the American forces that had broken through to the south. The concept was strategic. If the panzer divisions could reach Avranches, they would sever the logistical lifeline of Patton's Third Army and potentially reverse the entire operational situation in Normandy. Von Kluge understood why the concept was wrong. He knew what the road conditions were. He knew what the fuel state of the panzer divisions was. He knew what the weather forecast was, and he knew what clear weather in Normandy in August meant for a concentrated armored force attempting to move in daylight across 25 miles of open ground toward an objective that American commanders would recognize as soon as the attack began. He executed the order. The attack began in the early hours of the 7th of August, 1944. The assault element was 4 panzer divisions: the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the 116th Panzer Division, with additional infantry support from units already in the line. The initial advance, conducted in darkness and fog, achieved partial tactical surprise. The 2nd SS gained limited ground in the early morning hours. The 116th Panzer made some progress on the northern flank. By dawn, the attack had not yet collapsed. At dawn, the fog cleared. The 9th Air Force's 12th Tactical Air Command had been monitoring German radio traffic and observing vehicle movement on the roads west of Mortain since before the attack began. The morning of August 7th was initially obscured by the same fog that had aided the German advance. As it cleared, the air controllers began receiving reports from ground observers who could see German armored columns moving in the open. Quesada, at his headquarters, ordered maximum effort. The aircraft that were already airborne were redirected. Additional flights were launched. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the roads and field around Mortain were under attack by P-47s in a density that approached continuous presence over the most critical movement corridors. The officer commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, General Major Heinrich von Luttwitz, 50 years old, a decorated panzer officer who had commanded armored formations from France in 1940 through the Eastern Front and into Normandy, left an account of the 7th of August that has been cited in virtually every historical treatment of the Mortain counterattack. His description of the air attack is not the language of a man who was surprised by the existence of Allied air power. He had been operating under air threat for weeks. It is the language of a man describing a level of intensity that exceeded the operational baseline he had established as manageable. Von Luttwitz reported that his division's advance was halted not by American ground resistance. The infantry holding the line at Mortain was under severe pressure and in some sectors had been overrun, but by the loss of vehicle mobility that resulted from air attack on the road columns. Trucks and half-tracks burning on the roads created physical obstacles that surviving vehicles could not bypass in the bocage country. The destruction of fuel vehicles in the attack columns left armored elements stranded without the fuel to continue forward movement. The suppressive effect of continuous aircraft presence, the interruption of radio communication, the inability to move headquarters vehicles forward to maintain command contact, disrupted the coordination between the four attacking divisions at the critical moment when coordinated pressure was required. His language on the P-47s themselves is specific. He described the aircraft as operating in pairs, one covering the other through the attack and recovery sequence, which minimized the interval during which a vehicle crew could begin movement after one aircraft had pulled off. He noted the accuracy of the rocket attacks against vehicle targets in the open and the effectiveness of the guns strafing and killing crews who left their vehicles to seek cover in the hedgerows, a response that was itself a tactical dilemma, since remaining in a vehicle under air attack was also lethal. He was describing, without naming it as such, the tactical logic of a weapon system designed to remove options from its target. The Battle of Mortain, by the afternoon of August 7th, had ceased to be the German counteroffensive that Hitler had ordered and had become a German defensive problem. The panzer divisions that had been committed to the attack were now themselves at risk, because the American ground forces that had been absorbing the attack to the west were not the only American forces near Mortain. Patton's Third Army, driving south and east in its exploitation of the Cobra breakout, was already positioning to swing north around the German southern flank. The Mortain salient that had been intended as the spear point of a German offensive was becoming, in the rapidly shifting operational geometry of the Norman bocage, the western edge of a potential encirclement. Von Kluge saw this. He reported it to OKW. He was told to hold and continue the attack. He held. He did not continue the attack, because the fuel to continue the attack was not available and the aircraft overhead would not permit the movement required to bring it forward. What followed over the next 2 weeks was the closing of the Falaise pocket, the encirclement of the bulk of two German field armies, the 7th and the 5th Panzer Army, in a shrinking perimeter between American forces closing from the south and west and British and Canadian forces closing from the north. The pocket was never fully closed. A corridor at Falaise and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives remained open until the 19th of August and allowed the escape of approximately 40,000 German soldiers. But the forces trapped in the pocket, estimated at between 100,000 and 150,000 men, were subjected to continuous air and ground attack for nearly 2 weeks. The roads through which they attempted to withdraw became corridors of destruction that post-war assessors described as among the most comprehensive material losses inflicted on any army in a single campaign in the Second World War. The killing ground inside the Falaise pocket was documented by pilots, by ground commanders who entered it after its collapse, and by a series of aerial photographs taken by the Royal Air Force and the USAF that survived as the most graphic visual record of what continuous air attack could accomplish when applied to a concentrated, immobilized force with limited anti-aircraft resources. General Dwight Eisenhower, visiting the area shortly after its collapse, described the scene in his memoirs as one that could only be described by Dante. His language was controlled. The photographs require no description. The vehicle counts compiled by American and British assessment teams after the closure of the pocket are specific. More than 340 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed or abandoned. More than 2,500 wheeled vehicles destroyed. More than 800 artillery pieces abandoned or destroyed. These numbers do not include the equipment that had been destroyed in the preceding weeks of the campaign, during the Cobra breakout and the Mortain counterattack, or the equipment that surviving units had managed to bring back across the Seine before the pocket collapsed. They represent the material residue of an army that had attempted to operate in the face of an air threat it could neither adequately defend against nor maneuver around. The officer who had commanded Army Group B through this collapse was Gunther von Kluge. On the 15th of August, he was relieved of command by Hitler, who had concluded, on the basis of evidence that was circumstantial and intelligence reports that were partly accurate, that von Kluge had been in contact with the conspirators of the July 20th assassination attempt and had been prepared to open negotiations with the Allies if the attempt had succeeded. Von Kluge was ordered to return to Germany. He drove east from the front, stopped his car on a road in the Lorraine countryside, and took poison. He was 61 years old. He left a letter addressed to Hitler that has survived. In it, he said that he had done everything in his power to meet the military demands placed on him. He said that German soldiers had fought with extraordinary courage. He said that the weight of Allied air power had been a condition that exceeded the capacity of any tactical response available to the forces under his command. He was asking, from a man who would not accept the message, to be understood. The weight of Allied air power in Normandy was not a single weapon or a single tactic. It was a system, and understanding why that system had achieved the density and coordination it had in the summer of 1944 requires following several threads back to decisions made years earlier and thousands of miles away. The first thread is industrial. The P-47D Thunderbolt that carried out most of the ground attack work in Normandy was manufactured by Republic Aviation at its Farmingdale, New York plant and at a second facility in Evansville, Indiana. By the summer of 1944, the two plants combined were producing more than 600 P-47s per month. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, the German fighter bomber that was the Luftwaffe's closest equivalent for the ground attack mission, was being produced at a rate that had peaked in the spring of 1944 at roughly 600 per month across all variants. But that total included aircraft assigned to the fighter defense of Germany against the strategic bombing campaign to the Eastern Front, to the Mediterranean, and to other theaters. The fraction available to the ground attack mission in Normandy was a portion of a production total that was itself being compressed by the destruction of manufacturing facilities by the strategic bombing campaign that American industrial production was simultaneously sustaining. The numbers compounded in only one direction. The United States was building more aircraft than it was losing. Germany was not. The second thread is pilot training. The USAF had entered the war with a training infrastructure that was expanding, not contracting. By 1943 and 1944, American pilots were graduating from training programs that produced approximately 2,000 new pilots per month with between 300 and 400 hours of flying time before their first operational assignment. The German training establishment had been unable to maintain this output under the combined pressure of fuel shortages. Germany's aviation gasoline supply had been severely degraded by the strategic bombing of synthetic fuel plants beginning in the spring of 1944 and the loss of experienced instructor pilots to frontline reassignment. The replacement pilots entering Luftwaffe units in the summer of 1944 were not inferior in native ability or motivation. They were undertrained. In a tactical environment that punished errors quickly and definitively, undertraining was a death sentence at the individual level and a force degradation mechanism at the unit level. The third thread is doctrine, and this is the thread that connects the most directly to the experience of the German tank crews on the roads of Normandy. The Luftwaffe had been the dominant tactical air force in the world in 1940 precisely because it had been built around the concept of air-ground integration. The idea that air power was most effective when it was used in direct support of the Army's operational objectives, as a flying artillery that extended the reach and shock effect of armored and mechanized forces. This concept had worked because the Luftwaffe had possessed the aircraft, the pilots, the communications, and the coordination doctrine to deliver it. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost the material and human foundation on which that doctrine depended. It could not be present over the battlefield in the numbers and with the continuity that the doctrine required, and without that presence, the doctrine was a set of procedures for a capability that no longer existed at scale. What the Allied tactical air forces had done, what Quesada had built in the 9th Air Force, what Mary Conyngham had built in the 2nd Tactical Air Force on the British side, what the combined experience of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had deposited into the institutional practice of Allied air-ground operations, was a version of the same doctrine, built on a material and human foundation that was expanding rather than contracting. The system they had assembled by the summer of 1944 had achieved something that the Wehrmacht's own doctrine, in its most effective period, had only approached: genuine integration of air and ground operations at the tactical level, with communication chains short enough to be responsive to the speed of armored combat, and aircraft available in sufficient numbers to maintain the density of presence that made the system function as a system rather than as episodic support. The Panzer crews were living inside the consequences of this system. They were experiencing it not as a doctrinal statement, but as a condition of their operational existence. The sound of aircraft engines on a clear morning, the instinct to find cover, the calculation of whether the road ahead was exposed and for how many seconds, and whether those seconds exceeded the response time of a flight leader who had already been told by a controller on the ground that there was movement on that road. The mathematics of that calculation had been worked out by men in offices and classrooms and after-action review sessions far from Normandy. The German tank crews were doing the arithmetic at 30 kilometers an hour on a farm road with their engines running and their eyes on the sky. On the 7th of August, 1944, as the Mortain counterattack was being dissected from above, a young German Panzer officer named Ernst Bachmann, whose name does appear in the records, who was a Waffen-SS tank commander of established operational reputation with confirmed kills that ran to more than 80 Allied vehicles, was moving his Panther tank through the bocage near the village of Lillory when his vehicle was strafed by P-47s. Bachmann's account, recorded post-war, is not a complaint and not a claim of unjust treatment. It is a technical description of a tactical problem he had not been given the tools to solve. He had good situational awareness. He had a reliable vehicle. He had a crew that knew their work. None of these things gave him a method to engage an aircraft attacking from above at 350 miles per hour, with 8 machine guns firing simultaneously. His anti-aircraft capability was a cupel-mounted machine gun that required him to expose himself above the turret ring to operate. The geometry of the problem, the speed of the aircraft, the angle of attack, the brief window in which the target was in the gunner's field of fire, made effective anti-aircraft defense from a moving vehicle a matter of luck rather than skill. Bachmann was not a man who relied on luck. He managed his exposure. He found cover when cover was available. He moved at night when the mission permitted. He completed his tour. Many of his peers did not. The specific weight of what the P-47 campaign cost the German armored force in Normandy could be approached through several documentary trails. The first is the equipment loss records compiled by Army Group B's logistics section through the Normandy campaign. These records, captured after the war and analyzed by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and by subsequent historians, indicate losses in armored vehicles between the 6th of June and the 25th of August, the day the Falaise pocket was finally closed, of approximately 1,600 tanks and self-propelled guns, more than 3,000 artillery pieces, and more than 20,000 wheeled vehicles. The proportions of these losses attributable directly to air attack versus ground fire have been debated since the immediate post-war period, and the honest answer is that in many cases the attribution is genuinely unclear. A tank immobilized by an air attack on its fuel column and then destroyed by ground fire later appears in the ground fire column, when the causal chain begins in the air. The USSBS assessment, working from captured German records and interrogations of senior officers, attributed between 40 and 50% of German tank losses in Normandy to air attack. The Ardennes offensive demonstrated that German armored forces, given weather cover and the operational element of surprise, retained the capacity to execute complex offensive operations in 1944. But the conditions required to escape the air threat, darkness, weather, terrain, were also the conditions that degraded the German Army's own capacity for the rapid, flexible, decisive operational movement that its doctrine required. The Wehrmacht without mobility was not the Wehrmacht. The solution to Allied air superiority, taken to its logical conclusion, was to accept the operational paralysis that air superiority was designed to impose. The alternative, moving in daylight, accepting the losses, attempting to execute the mission regardless, was a calculation that the German army made in Normandy, and the record of what that calculation cost is in the fields and lanes between Saint-Lô and Falaise, in the tank loss reports of the armored divisions, in the dispatches of a field marshal who told the truth to people who did not want to hear it, and in the operational records of 8 P-47 pilots who spent the morning of the 26th of July hunting a dust trail on a farm road east of Saint-Gilles and found what they were looking for. The P-47 Thunderbolt remained in service with the United States Air Force until 1949. It was declared obsolete by the jet age. The mission it had performed in Normandy, close air support, battlefield interdiction, the systematic harassment of an enemy army's capacity to move and supply itself, was not declared obsolete, but it was subordinated in the Air Force's post-war doctrine to the strategic priorities of the nuclear age. And the institutional memory of what Quesada had built in the summer of 1944 was not reliably transmitted to the officers who would need it in the next war. Korea tested this institutional memory and found it incomplete. Vietnam tested it again. The close air support mission, the dirty, dangerous, low-altitude work that the P-47 had performed over Normandy, was not a mission that jet-powered aircraft were optimized for, and the Air Force that had inherited the memory of the 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign was not institutionally oriented toward preserving the lessons of the 9th Tactical Air Command. The lessons had to be relearned at cost in later conflicts by later generations of airmen and soldiers who had not been there. In the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, now relocated as part of the National Armor and Cavalry Collection, a Panzer IV tank stands on display. It is not an aircraft. It is not a P-47. It is the vehicle that was on the other side of the equation in Normandy, the weapon that the German army believed, going into the summer campaign of 1944, was the instrument of its operational superiority in armored combat. The tank is intact. Its armor is not penetrated. Its gun is operational. Everything about its design and construction represents the accumulated engineering and tactical knowledge of a military tradition that had produced the most effective armored force in the world in 1940. It is sitting still. That was the condition Allied air power worked to impose on it in the summer of 1944, and in the fields of Normandy and in the lanes of the Falaise Pocket, it imposed it. The tank that could not move could not fight. The army that could not move in daylight was not the army its doctrine had created. The system that had made movement impossible was not a single weapon or a single tactic or a single brilliant commander. It was the accumulated investment of an industrial power that had decided, late and imperfectly and with significant institutional resistance, that air power most directly serves the battle when it is placed at the disposal of the soldier who can see the target and the pilot who can reach it, connected by a radio and a shared understanding of what needs to happen in the next 3 minutes. That understanding cost money to build, years to develop, lives to test in North Africa and Sicily and Italy before it arrived in Normandy in the form of a P-47 pilot at 6,500 feet watching a dust trail on a farm road and reaching for his radio. The German tank crews heard the radio call in the form of 8 aircraft appearing over the hedgerow line, already in their dives, already past the point where dispersal could save the column. They had 3 minutes. They had less than that. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.